The Chihuahuan desert at night does not comfort you. It does not try to. It simply opens, wide and dark and indifferent, until the sky above feels less like a ceiling and more like something you could fall into if you stood still long enough. Polvo, New Mexico, sits at the end of a road that stops because it has nowhere left to go. A handful of lights, a gas station that closes at 7, a post office the size of a closet, and on the corner of what the locals loosely call Main Street, a restaurant called Tierra del Sol, where the overhead bulbs were replaced with oil lamps sometime in the 90s, and nobody thought to switch them back, because the warm amber they cast on the wooden tables turned out to be exactly right. Not romantic, not theatrical, just right. The kind of light that does not ask anything of you. Every night at 7 o'clock, a woman came in and sat at the corner table. Not because it was the best table, not because she preferred corners or shadows or the particular angle of the window. She sat there because that table had the wide wooden chairs, old merchant chairs, the kind built for a body that did not apologize for taking up space. And when she sat down, she did not have to look first, did not have to calculate, did not have to adjust. And that small thing, that ordinary and invisible freedom of not having to check, was something she had learned to treasure more than most people would understand. Her name was Nadia Voss. She was 26 years old, and she had eaten alone at that corner table for 23 consecutive nights. She would set her plate down, eat without rushing, sit a while longer after, looking out the east-facing window into the dark where the desert began and the town simply ended. Then she would pay, say thank you, and walk out into the dry Chihuahuan wind, and the whole exchange with another human being would amount to no more than, "Can I get more bread, and thank you, and good night." This was not loneliness. This was the structure she had built deliberately around herself, a rhythm as reliable as the desert itself, a place that did not change so that she could remain intact inside it. On the 24th night, a man pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. No excuse me. No, is anyone sitting here? He simply moved the chair and settled into it the way a person sits down at their own kitchen table, as though the corner booth at Tierra del Sol had always been a table for two, and he had simply arrived at the correct time. Nadia looked up. He set his hat on the table, ordered coffee without consulting the menu, and looked back at her with a steadiness so complete it was difficult to explain why it did not make her want to leave. "I didn't invite you to sit," she said. "I know." He met her eyes. "But this table has 4 chairs, and you've been using one of them for 23 nights. Seems like a waste." She studied him. "You've been counting." "I've been here 23 nights," he said, his voice flat and plain. Hard not to notice. He was the first person who had stepped into her routine without destroying it. That was the thing she would not admit until much later. Not that he had interrupted something, but that he had entered it so quietly that the rhythm continued, and she was still in it, and he was simply there now, on the other side of the table, as if the story had always had 2 seats. But before we stay at that corner table with them, tell me something. Have you ever had a place you kept returning to, not because anything changed, but because you needed it not to? And right now, where are you listening to this story from? Does it feel like somewhere familiar, or somewhere you're still learning how to belong? There are things about Nadia Voss that you notice before she speaks. Her hair, deep auburn and straight, worn down most days because no occasion in Polvo demanded anything else. It fell across her shoulders the way paint falls when you stop trying to control it, naturally, without apology. Her skin was pale and smooth, the kind that colors without warning, flushing at the cheeks whenever something caught her off guard, whenever someone said something true before she could build her expression around it. Her hands were small, with careful fingers, the hands of someone who draws, who marks, who does precise things slowly and with intention, and her body, full and warm, the kind of body the world had spent years giving her reasons to apologize for, carried itself through Tierra del Sol each evening with a quiet that had nothing to do with shame. She had been through the shame. She had come out the other side of it not triumphant, but simply tired of the alternative. She was a painter, or she had been before Santa Fe. The city had suited her for a while. The light there was good, dry, and clean, and the art community was close enough to offer connection without demanding it. She had worked for 2 years on a series of desert landscapes, paintings about space and openness, and what it means to exist without enclosure. And then, 6 weeks after her first gallery show opened, a well-known critic published a paragraph about her. Not about the work, about her. He wrote about how she did not look like an artist was supposed to look, how her appearance created a distance between the viewer and the canvas. How it was, he suggested with the particular cruelty of a person who believes they are being honest, difficult to take the art seriously when the artist herself seemed so at odds with the fragility of the medium. The paragraph was shared, it was laughed at, and Nadia stood in her own gallery on a Tuesday afternoon and watched people look at her paintings and then look at her, and she saw in their eyes the comparison being made, and she did not know where to put her face. She left Santa Fe 12 days later. 12 days, not because she needed the time, but because she kept telling herself that leaving was weak, that staying and enduring was the braver choice. It took her nearly 2 weeks to understand that walking away was not a retreat. It was a direction. It was the first honest decision she had made in months. She found Polvo on a map by looking for the town that appeared to be the furthest point from anywhere recognizable. She booked a room at the Lopez boarding house for 3 months, packed 1 bag and 1 box of painting supplies, and arrived on a Tuesday morning without a plan for what came after. The absence of a plan was the point. For the first time in her adult life, she did not need to know what was next, because what was next had always been shaped by other people's expectations, and she was done fitting herself inside the shape of someone else's idea of her. There are people who leave because they have run out of strength, and there are people who leave because they finally have enough of it. Nadia Voss was the second kind. Macon Greer had been in Polvo for 23 days before he sat down across from her, and in that time he had barely spoken to anyone beyond the basics. A room, a meal, directions to the water trough where he could settle his horse. He was 31, tall and solidly built in the way of someone who has done physical work outdoors for a decade. Broad shoulders, muscle that came from use rather than intention, a posture that had straightened itself out of necessity long before it became habit. His hair was dark, his skin the particular brown bronze of the Chihuahuan desert, earned by years of being where the work was, rather than where the shade was. His eyes were warm and unhurried. He had a way of looking at things, at the desert, at a fence line, at a person that was neither quick nor careless. A small scar cut through his left brow. He did not explain it. He was not by nature the kind of man who sat down next to strangers. He had come from Colorado, or from a ranch that had been in his family for 3 generations, and that his father ran with the particular authority of someone who had never considered that the land might belong to anyone other than the family name written on the deed. His father was not a cruel man. He was a certain man, certain about the right way to do things, certain about who was supposed to carry what forward, certain that a son had an obligation that ran deeper than personal inclination. Macon had spent 10 years in the space between staying and leaving, present enough that he could not be called absent, gone enough that he could not be called committed. Neither his father nor his younger brother nor Macon himself had ever been happy with this arrangement. But the arrangement continued because it was easier than the conversation required to end it. He had finally left 8 months ago, not dramatically, not with a declaration. He had simply loaded his horse into the trailer one morning and driven south until the land stopped looking familiar. He had been moving through small towns ever since, stopping when a place felt temporarily right, leaving when it stopped. He was, in every practical sense, a man who did not stay. And yet, 23 nights of watching the same woman eat alone at the corner table. 23 nights of noticing the way she lingered after her plate was cleared, looking out the east window with an expression that was not sadness exactly, but something more private, the face of a person working through something she had decided to carry alone. 23 nights of sitting at the table near the door and understanding, with an accuracy he couldn't have explained, that she was not broken. She was just honest about what she needed. He had never been able to stop noticing that kind of honesty in a person. There are people who keep moving because they cannot find a reason to stop, not because they are restless by nature, but because no place has yet offered them something that weighs more than the road. Macon Greer had not stayed anywhere in years, not because nowhere was good enough, because he had not yet found a reason that felt true. The morning after he sat down, he knocked on her door before 6. "What time do you go out to paint?" She looked at him through the half-open door. "Before the sun gets high, around 6. "Can I come?" "You don't paint?" "No," he said, "but I can be quiet while you do." It was not an offer to be useful, not a promise to understand. It was simply, I will take up very little space, and what space I take, I will hold quietly. And that, without either of them having words for it yet, was exactly the right thing to say. She said, "Give me 5 minutes. The Chihuahuan desert at dawn is a different world from the desert at any other hour. The air is still cold and sharp, not the cold of discomfort, but the cold of a thing not yet touched by the day, clean in a way that only people who live near harsh sunlight learn to treasure. The early light comes in low and gold, not yet white, and it falls across the red earth and the ocotillo and the saguaro at an angle that makes everything look more permanent, more itself, than it will for the rest of the day. Nadia had a flat rock she used as her station, a wide, low-surface 20 minutes walk east of town, where the land opened and the sky became visible in all directions. She set up her paints and her canvas and began the slow observational process of looking before she marked anything. Macon sat on a lower rock, 3 steps behind her, far enough to stay out of her field of vision, close enough that she knew he was there. He did not look over her shoulder, did not ask what she was painting or why she had chosen this angle over another, did not fill the silence with commentary. He sat the way he sat in a saddle on open land, present and still, and requiring nothing from the landscape except to exist inside it. Nadia painted in that silence and noticed something she had not expected. It was different from the silence she had been carrying alone. It was the same quiet, the desert, the morning, the sound of her brush, but there was a person in it now, and that small difference turned out to matter more than she could have anticipated. 2 hours later, when the sun climbed and the air began to shift, she set down her brush. "What did you think?" she asked. "Not about the painting, about the desert." "I understand why you're here," he said. "It doesn't have opinions about you." She looked at him. "You need that too." "I've needed it for a long time," he said. "I just didn't have a name for it until now." The days built themselves around this without either of them designing it. Mornings were not always shared. Some days he had the horse to tend to, some days she wanted the solitude back. Neither explained, neither asked. They had both lived long enough to know the difference between a morning that belonged to 2 people and a morning that did not, and they respected the distinction without having to negotiate it. Lunch found them at the corner table most days, not by arrangement, but because they were both hungry around noon, and Tierra del Sol was the only place in Polvo that served midday food. They ate without performance, without the specific effort of 2 people trying to seem comfortable with each other. They were, in fact, comfortable, though neither would have been able to say exactly when that had happened. The afternoons were when they talked. There was something in the late Chihuahuan light, the way it tilted west, the way it changed the color of the earth from red to orange to something close to violet, that made honesty easier. As though the landscape were slowly removing every layer that was not necessary, until only the true version of a person remained. They walked the dirt road east of town, the one that led into the desert and did not lead anywhere specific. You simply walked until you felt like stopping, and then you stopped. He noticed small things about her, the way she touched surfaces before she painted them, as if checking their temperature, the way she moved her hands when she described a color, tracing something in the air between them, the way she went quiet before she said something she actually meant, a half-second pause that preceded every real thought. She noticed things about him, too, the way he carried silence without apologizing for it, the way he asked questions that were never rhetorical. When he asked, he was genuinely waiting for the answer, the way he looked at the horizon as if he had a working relationship with distance, as if he and the far edge of the visible world had an understanding. One afternoon he walked slightly closer than he had before. Not by much. It was not a move. It was simply proximity. And she did not shift away. The silence between them was no longer empty. It had a person inside it. Both of them could feel the difference, and neither said anything, because some things are more true before they become words. It happened on a Thursday, at a table in the golden light of Tierra del Sol, over coffee that had gone slightly cold. She told him about Santa Fe, not the version with the gallery and the opening and the polite congratulations, the version that came after, the paragraph, the way it circulated, the way she stood in her own space and felt the air in the room rearrange itself around what had been written about her body instead of her work. "I didn't know where to look," she said. Her voice was level. She had told this story before only to herself, and she had learned to carry it without breaking. "I didn't know what my face was doing. I just knew I needed to not be there." "But you stayed for 12 more days," he said. "I thought I should." A pause. "I thought leaving would prove something, give them something to say. So I stayed and I sat with it, and every day I walked into that gallery and stood in front of my own paintings and felt like a stranger to them." She looked at the table. "Took me 12 days to understand that going wasn't giving up." It was the first intelligent decision I'd made since I read that paragraph. Macon did not say, "I'm sorry," did not say, "That's terrible," or "He was wrong," or "You're beautiful," any of the things a person says when they want to offer comfort, but haven't thought carefully about what comfort actually requires. He said, "What did it feel like, realizing you could leave?" She looked up at him, "Like exhaling." He nodded, slowly, holding that. Then, "I've been holding my breath for 10 years. She waited. He told her about his father, about the ranch in Colorado that had been in the family since his grandfather broke the ground, about the expectation that had settled over him the moment he was old enough to understand what inheritance meant in that family. Not cruelty, his father was not a cruel man, but certainty. The absolute certainty that Macon would stay and carry it forward, and that this certainty required no conversation because it was simply the way things were. "I never said I didn't want it," he said. "Not clearly. I just kept leaving and coming back. Never enough of either to be honest about what I actually wanted." "What did you actually want?" He thought about this. "To stop feeling like my life was a thing I was borrowing." There was no advice exchanged, no wisdom offered, no attempt by either of them to reframe or resolve the thing the other person had just placed on the table. They simply sat with each other's truths the way you sit with someone in a hospital waiting room, not because you can do anything, but because the sitting itself is the thing. To be truly seen, not the version of yourself that people describe, not the outline of you that fits inside someone else's narrative, but actually seen with all the weight and contradiction and ordinariness intact, is rarer than being loved. It requires a kind of attention most people are too busy or too frightened to offer. In the warm amber light of Tierra del Sol, for the first time in a long time, 2 people offered it. He had told her on the first night that he was leaving the next day. He had not left. Neither of them addressed this directly. It existed between them the way weather exists, present, acknowledged in small practical ways, never formally declared. He was still here. His horse was still stabled at the edge of town. His room at the boarding house still had his boots outside the door each morning. But Polvo was not somewhere a person stayed indefinitely. It was the kind of place that gave you what you came for and then released you. And Macon had no plan past the current week, and Nadia's lease ran 2 months from now. And after that, she had told him honestly, she did not know. "Have you thought about where you'll go?" he asked one evening, on the walk back from the eastern road. "I've thought about it the way you think about weather you can't predict," she said. "I know it's coming. I don't know what it'll look like." "Does that scare you?" She considered. "Less than it used to. When I got here, I didn't have a plan past 3 months, and that felt like standing at the edge of something. Now it just feels like open. He walked beside her without responding immediately. The desert was going purple at the edges, the Sierra Diablo range darkening to the north. The wind had shifted, bringing the cooler air down from the high ground. "I could be anywhere in 2 weeks," he said. This was not a threat or a warning. It was an honesty. "I know," she said. They walked in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable silence, the kind that acknowledges something without forcing it into words before it is ready. Distance is not a place. It is not the number of miles between 2 points on a map. It is a decision made or not made, day after day, in the small choices that either close or maintain the space between people. Some people live in the same house and remain miles apart. Some people are separated by a road and still somehow in each other's presence completely. Macon knew how to maintain distance. He had practiced it for 10 years, with his father, with his brother, with every town he'd passed through without leaving a mark. He was skilled at the particular detachment of a person who moves before the leaving becomes painful. And for the first time in a long time, that skill felt like a limitation rather than a protection. The call from Colorado came on a Wednesday. His brother's voice was careful, the voice of someone relaying news that has weight without wanting to be the one to carry it across the line. Their father was not well. Nothing catastrophic, nothing sudden, but not well. The kind of not well that asks a question without asking it directly. Macon sat outside the boarding house after the call, in the dirt with his back against the wall, and stayed there for a long time. Nadia came back from the East Road at noon and found him there. She sat down beside him without asking. "Did not say what happened, or are you okay, or do you want to talk?" She placed her hand on the back of his hand where it rested on his knee, a small, warm weight, and stayed. When he finally spoke, it was not the beginning of a long explanation. It was just, "I might need to go back." "Okay," she said. The days that followed moved differently. Not badly, but with a new texture, the way familiar music sounds different when you learn you may not be able to hear it again for a while. The morning still came. He still walked with her to the rock east of town some days. But his eyes were more often on the road north, and there were longer pauses in conversation that had nothing to do with comfort. She noticed. She did not fill the pauses. He noticed her noticing and not filling them. And that restraint, that refusal to crowd him while he was figuring something out, meant more to him than she probably understood. One morning she came out to paint, and he was not at the boarding house door. He had gone to check the horse, to think through logistics, to turn the decision over without an audience. She went out alone. She sat at the flat rock and looked at the canvas and did not paint anything for 20 minutes, just sat with the light. Later, he found her at the corner table. "I should go," he said. "Soon, while I still know why." She looked at him. "Do you know why?" "Because my father is not young and I have things left unsaid with him." A pause. "And because if I don't go now, I'll find more reasons to wait. And waiting is just a different kind of leaving." She nodded. "You know what's funny," she said. "You're doing exactly what I did, taking 12 days to figure out what you already knew." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Maybe." It is only when something becomes uncertain that we understand what it has been holding in place. not the thing itself, but everything that existed because of its presence. The weight only becomes visible when you're about to set it down. He left for Colorado on a Thursday morning. The night before, they stood outside Tierra del Sol under a sky that was doing everything the Chihuahuan sky knew how to do. The stars low and dense, the Milky Way, a white arc from one edge of the horizon to the other, the darkness so complete and so populated at the same time that it felt like a different version of the word large. "I'll be back," he said. Not a question, not a promise shaped like a question to give him room to walk it back if he needed to. A statement, flat and plain, and offered with the same quality he used for everything he actually meant. "I know," she said. He looked at her then. In the desert dark, her hair shifting in the cold wind from the north, her eyes gray-blue and steady on his face. "I need you to know something before I go," he said. "That first night, I didn't sit down because I felt sorry for you. I didn't sit down to be kind or because it seemed like something a decent person would do." He paused. "I sat down because 23 nights I watched you, and I understood something about what you were doing there, and I couldn't leave without at least having sat across from you once." She did not look away. "What did you understand?" "That you weren't eating alone because no one would have you. You were eating alone because it was the one place you didn't have to manage anyone else's response to you." His voice was quiet. "I've been looking for that kind of peace my whole adult life and never found it. And you built it out of a corner table and a schedule and the right chair." A silence opened between them, not asking to be filled. "When you come back," she said slowly, "what are you coming back to?" He looked at her steadily. "That depends on you." She breathed in, the desert cold, the sage and mineral smell of the open ground. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Figure out what you need to figure out. Come back when you're ready." A pause. "I'll still be at the corner table." He took one step closer. The kind of step that is a question without being a sentence. She did not step back. He raised one hand and placed it against her face, his palm broad and warm and rough from years of real work, and she lifted her own hand and held his there, not pulling it closer, simply holding it in place. Two people who had both spent a long time not trusting stillness, choosing stillness together. No declaration, no grand promise, only a choice, made quietly, in the dark, in the desert that did not care either way, and was, for exactly that reason, the only place either of them could have made it honestly. Staying is not something you say once. It is something you do again and again, in small increments, in early mornings, and difficult evenings, and ordinary Tuesdays, when there is no particular reason to stay except that you want to. He was gone for 12 days. On the 12th day, the door of Tierra del Sol opened at 7:15 in the evening, and Macon Greer walked in from the Chihuahuan night with the particular quiet of someone who has set something down and arrived lighter because of it. She was at the corner table. She looked up when the door opened. He crossed the room without hurrying and sat down in the chair across from her, the chair that had been empty for 12 days and that had, in its emptiness, managed to hold something. "Have you eaten?" he asked. "I was waiting for you," she said. 4 words, simple, with nothing performed about them. They ate until the oil lamps were turned down for the second time. Then they walked out into the desert night together. And the sky was doing what the Chihuahuan sky always did when no one asked it to, spreading itself out in every direction without apology. He had gone to Colorado. He had sat across from his father and said the things that had been waiting unsaid for a decade. His father had not responded the way Macon had hoped, but the saying had happened, and the saying was what had been needed, and he had driven south again with the windows down and the desert coming up on both sides of the highway, and something in his chest that felt, for the first time in years, like room. 3 weeks after he returned, the lease on Nadia's room at the Lopez boarding house ended. She did not renew it. On the last morning, she packed her paints and folded the bedding and stood in the small room that had held her through 23 days of solitude and everything that came after. She said thank you to the room, quietly, to no one. Not because it was sentimental, but because she meant it. Then she walked out into the Trans Pecos morning, where Macon was waiting with a borrowed truck, and the question of what came next. He had land 12 minutes outside of town, a piece of ground his father had deeded to him years ago, land that had been sitting unused and waiting, while Macon was busy not knowing what to do with it. It faced south, with open desert running uninterrupted toward the Mexican border. Open sky, red earth, quiet that was not absence, but presence. She had told him she needed east-facing windows for the studio. He had made sure of east-facing windows, wide enough that the full width of the Chihuahuan morning could come through without being edited. They did not put a name to what they were building. It did not need one. They woke early. She painted in the light that came in from the east, that sharp, angled light of the desert morning that she had been chasing since Santa Fe, and had only found correctly here. He worked the land, tended the horse, built things with his hands in the way that had always been more natural to him than words. They met in the middle of the day, and sometimes talked, and sometimes didn't. The corner table at Tierra del Sol was still theirs most evenings, but it was no longer the center of the story. What had once been the only constant she could hold on to, that table, that chair, that predictable dark, had become simply one place among the places that belonged to her life. She was no longer returning to it because she needed it not to change. She was returning because she wanted to. There is a difference between those two things. It is the difference between surviving and inhabiting, between enduring a life and choosing it. The Chihuahuan Desert does not offer promises. It is too honest for that. It gives you light that makes you see clearly, and wind that takes things from you, and silence that tells you exactly what you're made of when no one is watching. It is not gentle, but it is fair. Two people who had each come here to stop being known the wrong way had found, without looking for it, someone who knew them correctly, not completely. You never know a person completely, but truly. The way things are true in good light, they were not who they had been when they arrived. They were lighter, more open, more willing to let the day be what it was, rather than what they needed it to be. The desert had not changed. They had. And that, quiet and unannounced and entirely sufficient, was everything. Out here in the desert, the wind takes many things away, but sometimes it leaves something behind, not something planned, not something expected, but something that chose to stay. Before we leave them there tonight, I want to ask you something. Do you believe someone like him, a man who spent his life moving on, can truly learn to stay when it matters? Or are some people only meant to sit across from you for a while before they disappear down the road again? And as you're listening to this, where are you right now? What were you doing when this story reached you? Does it feel like a place you return to again and again? Or a place you're finally ready to leave behind? Tell me what you think. I read every comment under these stories.